All right, welcome to Couch Conversations. We are here with Jason Daniels today, and he is going to be our guest. We're very excited. So I'm going to let him introduce himself.
Sure, thank you. As mentioned, my name is Jason Daniels. I'm a researcher with the Community University Partnership for the Study of Child, Youth, and Family at the University of Alberta. And I do lots of research related to children's development and more specifically looking at the impact of technology on kids and how it affects their development and their learning and their socialization and other aspects of their development.
That's awesome. This is all my favorite stuff. So I actually saw you last year, I think it was last spring, I can't remember, at a Edmonton Public Library event. And there's something you said that really stood out for me. And it wasn't, obviously, it was just kind of regular technology situations, nothing like this right now. But you said we need to figure out, like, what is just different and what do we need to worry about? Because I thought that was really profound. We all kind of get stuck in what things were like when we were kids, right? And we're like, so what's just different?
It is.
Now?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the big challenges that we struggle with. I mean, not even just related to technology, but in always sort of viewing what our kids are doing. But I think that it really comes out with technology because it's so pervasive in our society now. That's like it's so different from our growing up experience, and we tend to have sometimes selective memories about how everything was ideal when we were young, and we were much better at this and that, and we didn't use technology. But the world is a lot different than when a lot of us grew up, and some of that difference may be good or bad, and some of it's just different. It's not good or bad or otherwise. It's a different world that we live in. And so part of what I try to do when I look at like technology is not focus so much on is it good or bad, but try to look and see what is the impact, and if there is an impact, what advice can we sort of generate to be able to use it more effectively, or to avoid certain things if we have to. But just trying to really understand what is the overall impact of growing up in this kind of a digital environment.
Yeah. Do we know what a lot of the impacts are? Are we kind of like guessing?
We're some of it, honestly, we're still kind of guessing a little bit. I mean, we're starting to get some ideas about some things that are different. I mean, so for example, just in terms of a positive that we might say, okay, well, is this a negative or positive? And it's even coming out right now. The ability for us to connect with others over a distance, I think is one of the positives of technology that sometimes we maybe, if we just say technology is all bad, we might miss. If you think about being able to keep in contact with grandparents who live at a distance, or like now when we're all stuck in our homes, being able to maintain those relationships that might otherwise be more difficult. I mean, if we're honest and go back to how it was back when we were kids, it's not even comparable. I went to Europe the summer after I graduated from high school, and I didn't talk to my parents once, not because I didn't want to talk to them, because it cost so much to call long distance that it was not worthwhile doing that. My daughter lived in Europe a few years ago, and I talked to her more when she lived in Europe than when she lived here, because she would FaceTime me every day. So I think that's actually a pretty cool thing, and I think that a lot of the research is starting to show that ability to maintain communication over a distance is actually a positive of technology. Where the challenge comes in, this is kind of the nuance, is, and again, as we're seeing now in this COVID environment, that type of relationship is still not the same as having an in-person, face-to-face conversation. So if that's the only type of communication that we're having, then that's going to be a problem. So part of it also is about balance, and being able to balance out virtual relationships with face-to-face real relationships.
That makes sense. Yeah. It's funny you say that, because I found that too, even in COVID, there was a time where I was like, wow, I feel like I'm almost talking to some people more. Yeah. And I don't know if it's just because you don't have to go anywhere, right? You can just pick up and chat with people.
Yeah. So I mean, it's a two-edged kind of thing, right? There can be some goods and there can be some bad. And so focusing it and going back to the original question, focusing this on, questions of good or bad, sometimes it's problematic when we say the world is different and we just need to understand how to best navigate through this particular environment that we happen to be in right now.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense, because I think a lot of the questions we were getting were mostly concern, right? Like,
Yeah,
oh my goodness, like they're going to be behind on stuff or behind on social things, and so I think it'll be calming to hear like it's just different.
it is. It is. And our environment right now is unprecedented, right? Is this going to have an impact on our kids? Probably. It's going to have an impact on all of us, right? And so we do the best we can in the environment we're in right now, and try to mitigate some of the potential problems. But
Yeah. Well, and when you said that, that made me think of like, well, we're mitigating the illness, right? So this is the lesser of
exactly.
the possible evils, right? We're not getting sick, we're not possibly losing loved ones, right? This is the good option.
It is, right? But it's like taking Tylenol, right? You look at the side effects, there are some side effects, they're pretty minimal. I mean, but you always have to make those kind of judgment calls, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to take this, it's going to make my headache go away, but there might be some liver damage if I take too much of it, or things like that. I mean, it's probably not the best example, but
It works. There's always trade-offs.
yeah.
Awesome. Do you think there are any like main concerns that people should be aware of to keep in mind?
Yeah, I mean, one of the ones, and this is sort of a carryover from some of the stuff we saw before. I mean, one of the big concerns when using technology is, COVID aside, is the amount of time that it takes up. And part of the problem is what I kind of refer to as opportunity costs. So if a child is sitting in front of a screen for X number of hours a day, what are they not doing instead? Right. And so one of the big challenges that we saw pre-COVID, and I imagine still is probably a problem right now, is children growing up in homes in front of devices and parents in front of the devices where they're not getting enough face-to-face quality interaction with parents or caregivers or others. And so one of the potential downsides of that is then the negative impact on social skills, because a lot of those basic social skills, like fundamental things like being able to read emotional expressions on people's faces, which is critical for human beings to get along in communal kind of environments or societies, those start to develop early on in the home when children are interacting with caregivers. And so if those kind of interactions are being interrupted by constant pervasive technology use, then the kids aren't getting those kind of fundamental skills they need. And so one of the things that I would be concerned about now again is not that kids are using technology, like even if they're using a little bit more than before, they're going to be fine. It's not the technology use that's going to necessarily impact them, but if that technology is replacing or taking the place of one-to-one, face-to-face kinds of interactions, then that can be a problem over the long term.
So we'd have to, even the adults and stuff would have to be watching their use as
I
well.
think so.
Because it's that two side.
Yeah, I mean, and we often talk about it as technology and kids, but the more I've done this, what I've realized is, yes, I mean, technology, because they're developing, can have an impact on things like social skills, but this is a broader topic than just technology and kids. It's technology and parents, technology and families, and that's kind of what I mean in terms of like it's distracting us from those one-on-one, very important kinds of human interaction that are absolutely fundamental, is it, for development, but also for mental well-being and health and whatnot. So this is a problem for all of us. So if we get into like teenagers, I mean, one of the big things that I would look for in kids of all ages, but especially as you get into teenagers, is self-isolating, going into their rooms, playing on their video games, using their social media, but doing it holed up somewhere private in the home and not interacting with anybody else. That'd be one of the big things that I'd be concerned about, but could also apply to younger kids as well.
Yeah. Are there any other, I know we had one question about like teens specifically, like is there any specific concerns other than that, like for teens versus younger children? I know they were worried about like news, where like teens have more access to their phone devices generally.
Generally, I mean, in some of the issues, I mean, obviously, critical thinking and the ability to critically appraise the information that they're getting online. So that's sort of a general problem or a general issue. Now, if we talk about the current environment that we're living in with COVID and all of the negative news and different types of things, it can be overwhelming. I mean, as an adult, I found that for me, it was becoming a time sink where I would start in the morning and start looking at all the horrible reports on COVID and people dying and the hopelessness. And like about 3 weeks ago, I just made a decision saying like, this is like not helping me as an adult, like and I think a fairly well functioning adult. And I just had to stop reading the news reports about that. So I worry about kids getting down that same kind of sinkhole or that negative news cycle where they're following the news reports and they're not able or don't have necessarily the capacity to pull themselves back out of that kind of a negative information loop. Yeah.
It doesn't sound super different from adults though, right? Like you've been.
I mean, if you talk about these things, I don't think it's necessarily a difference always in terms of, adults versus teens versus kids. For some of these things, it's a matter of degree. Like I think a lot of us adults struggle with the same things that our kids are struggling with. I mean, but some of us, not all of us, some of us have perhaps better coping skills. I mean, if we talk about, in some of the talks I do, we talk about brain development and the impact it has on things like impulse control. And I mean, one of the things we know about the human brain is that our impulse control, or the parts of our brain that are responsible for impulse control, really aren't fully developed till about age 25. And so teenagers, I mean, kids, young 20-year-olds have a harder time being able to control those impulses, like impulse to constantly check their news feeds and stuff. So it's not that, adults can and teens can't, but it's harder for teens to be able to do that. And so, I mean, again, you talk about this for hours and hours and hours. But I mean, one of the challenges then is we talk about things like technology addiction and using social media too much and things like that. A lot of those platforms are designed and originally have their major breakthroughs with teens and preteens and young kids, and I don't think it's coincidence. Those are the times when human beings are most susceptible to developing maladaptive kinds of habitual behaviors. I suspect that the developers of those things know exactly the age range that they want to target. And that's, to me, that's a bit of an ethical problem.
Yeah. I know one person I was talking about when I was like saying we were going to talk with you, they were like saying the flip side, and they're like, well, I'm finding like teens are pretty good because they've kind of grown up with it and get that it's marketing and it's things like that. But they're saying they were struggling with like their parents. So like seniors, like 70s, 80s that are now using this technology a lot more and are like struggling with it and maybe getting pulled into like different areas. I know that's not your expertise, but.
No, but I mean, there's some of that too. We look at, and again, anecdotally, I've heard the same types of things where you get parents or grandparents that think that they're now friends with some celebrity, which you guys, well, you're not really, right? This is not really them online. So, I mean, there is some of that and different types of scams and things like that. So, I mean, perhaps, I mean, when we go back to that first question you had about, what's just different, I mean, there probably are some benefits to being able to grow up within this environment with respect to understanding some of the pitfalls and things like that. I would say, however, sometimes that does give us a false sense of security. And it's always like, well, everybody else is at risk, but I'm okay and I can handle it. Whereas the reality is you probably can't handle it as quite as well as you think you can, right?
Yeah, it's easy for me to see the scams that are targeted at 70-year-olds, but there's probably lots targeted at me that work just fine.
Yeah.
Different market. So within that, you could kind of mention like a few things, but are there any like strategies you would use like universally or for certain age groups, or is it really just focusing on getting that face to face?
Yeah, I think part of it is, in terms of overall strategies, it's really low tech, but it's like balance. It's all, trying to balance everything out. And instead of just sort of saying, well, I'm going to cut out, all my technology, which is really not a realistic thing to do. And I think that going down that route, it ends up not working because it's just not feasible. So I try to focus rather on kind of balance and mindfulness. And so by balance, what I mean is, sure, like go online, watch Netflix, do whatever, but balance that out with like actual real interactions. And so part of what I try to do, I'm not always the best at this, but try to do is have, for example, like times and places in my house where we don't use technology, like at the dinner table, for example. And we just started this game, and my kids actually are better at it than I am, but we sit down for dinner and everybody puts their phones in the middle, and the first one who picks up their phone has to do dishes. It's great because we've had more face-to-face conversations, with everybody putting their phones away than we have had otherwise. So I think that's one of the things, not using technology in the bedrooms. There's some general practices that can help do this. The other thing that I would say is if people are wanting to reduce the amount of time that they or their kids are using technology, one of the least effective ways I've found to be able to do that is just to try to go cold turkey, and just sit there and not do anything. One of the things that seems to work better is using what we know about human behavior and behaviorism to kind of like use reinforcement and other types of things to retrain our brains to be able to use technology more effectively. And so, part of that could be, let's take an hour, and we're not going to use technology for an hour. But then the flip side of this is where the behaviorism comes is you need to provide some alternative form of activity that is going to be in some way rewarding or reinforcing, right? So instead of just sitting there thinking about how much you miss your phone, put the phones down and then do something else that's fun, right? So that people aren't looking at those times as, times of dread, but that they can be looking forward to those particular times. And then you can build that up over time, right? And you practice that. It's like any other skill. You practice and you practice and you practice and you practice. And over time, it gets better.
I like that. I surprisingly have never heard that, right? It's always like balance, but it's never like, hey, like work up to it and actually something you enjoy instead.
Yeah, but it's basic behavioral science. This stuff that we've known for like, decades. And we know it works. Right? And some of the problems with it, and this is, I think, where it falls apart, but I think maybe knowing more about how humans react to these types of things can also help, because we know, for example, as well, even if we work with rats and pigeons, when you start removing a stimulus, what's going to happen is we see what we call a response burst. So if this was like a rat that I was trying to train not to, eat food pellets or whatever it was, the minute I stopped giving the rat food pellets for doing something that it's always been doing, right, or the thing that was reinforcing to it, what I see is a response burst. So the rat comes in and will push a paddle like multiple times or things like that. So you see this huge response burst. Same thing, if you want a human equivalent, if you go to a vending machine and put your your money in and the vending machine doesn't spit out your pop or your food or whatever it was. Look at the actual physical behavior, and what you'll see is people like bang, 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 slamming the machine, shaking the machine. It's the exact same behavior you see in a rat or a pigeon or a dog or anything like that. And so what you can expect to see in, for example, kids is you take away their phone for an hour, what you're going to have happen initially is an increase in the behaviors, right? They're gonna freak out a little bit. But guess what? It goes down over time, right? And so if we understand what we're in for and know what to expect, I think it's maybe a little bit easier to deal with those problems and have hope that yes, the response is not good right now, but it'll get better over time, especially if I'm replacing it with something reinforcing or something alternative thing that will, you know, help them to overcome that initial kind of negative response.
See, that's also super helpful and something I haven't heard before.
Yeah, I mean, that's just it, but I mean, we like to think sometimes as humans we're way different than animals, but in a lot of our basic responses, we're pretty similar to all sorts of other animals and how they respond to stimuli.
Yeah, okay, that's perfect. So we're expecting it to be a little rough at the beginning, and then it'll get better.
It gets better. Yeah.
Perfect. All right. I'm checking my list. I have one specific question from someone on Facebook. And it was, is there any data on technology and media's relationship with fatigue? And they said, other than using it before bed, like other than disrupting your sleep. So I don't know if they mean like, does it just make you more tired? And I know we've seen things. Yeah.
I think, I mean, there's a couple of things in terms of data. So obviously the biggest one and the one that people focus on is the one you mentioned with sleep and sleep quality and things like that. So just general fatigue. However, there's emerging data coming out, and there's not tons of it, but there's emerging data coming out looking at the impact of, for example, being on Zoom meetings all day versus being in a face-to-face kind of conversation. And it seems like that the same amount of meeting time in a virtual space is much more taxing on our brains and our cognition than the same kind of in-person, face-to-face kind of meeting. So there is some emerging research looking at that. I wouldn't say we have anything conclusive yet, but I think anecdotally a lot of us are living through this and experiencing that, you know, having a full day of virtual meetings feels way more exhausting than a full day of face-to-face meetings. So I would say I think there is some research on that. There's some research on eye strain and, you know, video games and TV and stuff like that. So there is some research on that as well. So I would say yes, there is. A lot of it's still kind of emerging, and we're not quite there yet. But anecdotally, I think there's lots of hints that probably there is something different about, you know, being in a virtual environment than being in a face-to-face environment.
I know we don't know, but would you think that would be even more for kids than adults, or would it be the same?
Oh, it definitely would be more. I mean, again, if you think about the differences in terms of sort of cognition and cognitive ability within kids and adults, as we get older, we develop more effective strategies for dealing with what we call our cognitive load, which is kind of all the stuff that we're having to pay attention to and think about and do stuff like that. So one of the things that we get better at as we get older is we get lots of little shortcuts that allow us to focus on what we deem to be the most important information and to not focus on the other stuff that's not important. It's part of that whole impulse control. The same parts of the brain are responsible for this and being able to block out the stimuli that aren't important. So for young kids, definitely it's going to be a little bit harder for them to be able to block out the competing stimuli, to focus on the most important stuff. And as a result, what you probably see, and this we do have research on, you're going to see impacts in terms of ability to pay attention, the amount of information that they're able to retain, all that kind of stuff will be impacted by prolonged exposure to technology. The other complicating factor as well in that is the number of different things that we're attending to in terms of technology. So if I've got music playing and I'm texting on my phone and the TV's on in the other room, every one of those little bits of information or technology or distraction can impact my ability to focus. And again, if you want like an analogy or an example, think about when you're driving. Like there's times when I drive, or I used to drive home from work, and I would get to my house and have absolutely no recollection of the drive home.
Yes.
Right? That's only possible because my brain, as I get older, starts to automatize, right? Starts to look for those shortcuts that allow me to focus more of my attention on singing my songs and focus all the other stuff and not the driving stuff, right? But if you've ever been doing that and you get caught in like a blizzard, right? All of a sudden what happens is you need to turn down the radio, you tell everybody in the car to shut up, right? And so what happens is all of that other stuff that was competing for your attention, right, is now it's too much, right? You have to remove all of that stuff so you can focus just on driving. And so if we talk about ourselves within like a cognitive environment, like a learning environment or whatever, all the stuff going on around us, we either are attending to or blocking out. And so the older we get, the better we are at being able to differentiate some of those things. That was a really long-winded example. So I apologize if I...
No, it was perfect. And it made me like, one, it reminded me of definitely like being lost, like going to someone's house for the first time and like turning down the radio as I look at the houses to be like, where am I?
Yeah, exactly, right? Because you're reducing the cognitive load, the load on your brain, so you can be able to allocate more resources to the tasks that you need to do.
But I also noticed in like the first week or two of working from home, I turned off so many notifications on my laptop because I was like bouncing around. I couldn't concentrate. So I had to turn off like email notifications and be like, I will check these later.
That's amazing. That's what we've been asking people to do for years, just in terms of just regular life, right? One of the most simple things you can do is just turn off your notifications.
Yeah.
Because what it does is it puts you back in charge of your technology use.
It helped a lot because already my brain wasn't working so good in those first couple of weeks. So,
Totally.
but yeah, that makes sense. Too much load. This is awesome. Is there anything else that you want people to know, or misconceptions you've heard that you want to correct? This is your time.
Well, I think one of the things, especially right now, but in general, is I think that we need to stop feeling guilty about, you know, our kids using technology and how much we use technology. I don't think guilt is always the best motivator for change. Like we're all figuring this out and stuff like that. So I would rather, and I don't want to, and I try really hard not to, when I do these things, to like try to heap guilt on people. But what I'd rather have people focus on is figure out where you are right now, and then figure out, what kind of an improvement I can make today, whatever that is, right? And if it's simply just turning off your notifications, great, be happy about that, right? That's a great improvement. And then move on to something else, right? Like, so I think 2 times we just look at it, like I do, and think, my goodness, I've just like screwed up my kids royally. They're pretty resilient, right? In general, they're probably going to be okay, right? Most kids kind of end up getting through and being fine. So let's stop being so hard on ourselves and just focus on, what can I do a little bit better today? And then go from there.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. This has been super helpful for me, so I'm sure it'll be helpful for everyone else too.
Yeah. No, this is fun.
Awesome.